Hey guys, so I thought I'd try something new and basically use my past top cut most played hand trap videos to look at the trend in the most popular hand traps for the past year or so. And before I continue, a big thanks to all of my sponsors. I'll have all of their links down below in case you're interested in them. Now, for those of you that are familiar with my channel, you'll know that whenever we have some premier Yu-Gi-Oh event, I typically provide a breakdown of the most played hand traps among the topping list. Now, looking back to July of last year, the events that I covered for these hand trap videos involve luxury gaming series tournaments, which involve some of the best players in the game, then some remote dual YCSs, and once in-person events came back, we have coverage of the recent YCS events as well as the TCG championships. As you can tell, I don't have an event for every month in the past year because some months there just weren't any big tournaments, especially last year during lockdowns. But these are the events that this current video will be based on when looking at the trend of the most played hand traps. Also note that the most recent event included in this video is the South and Central American TCG Championship in June, as I did not have time to cover the North American Championship that happened recently. Now first, let's start with the trend of the median number of hand traps played in the main deck in the past year. So we're going to start with the July 2021 with LCS 15, which is when Drytrons and Tri-Brigade were tier 1, and a median of 9 hand traps was still pretty high. But then it ended up being even higher at 11 hand traps the next month at the remote dual YCS, where the meta was still largely the same, and technically the remote YCS was actually also in July, but I made that video in August, so just keep that in mind. Obviously, Drytrons were just insane at this point, so you needed a lot of hand traps to prevent them from making anything, because once they got to Herald with oranges in hand, you just couldn't really break that board. Now after that, we did drop in the number of hand traps to as low as 6 in the main in November 2021, which was the Pack LCS, and this is where Tri-Brigade Lyrilisk was now the best deck, and Dogmatic Invoke was still strong as well. This is where Sword Soul was also first released. I think where it really pops is the fact that we moved all the way up to a median of 15 hand traps in the main in April of this year, which was YCS Charlotte, and this was because there were so many 60 card pile decks involving Brave Token and DPE, where naturally players ran more hand traps because of the increased deck size. Now when I looked at the proportion of hand traps relative to the main deck size, this percentage also still increased compared to the past. Now of course, after the ban list that took into effect in May with the ban of Anaconda for starters, that did kill off the 60 card pile deck, so we've sort of gradually seen this decline in the number of hand traps in the main, at least for now, but seems like there are usually around 8 hand traps in the main. So now let's cover some of the most popular hand traps in more detail, so let me help you interpret this graph along with some of the caveats that you need to know. So basically, the percentages represent the proportion of topping decks that played a certain hand trap, in this case Ash, at whatever event for that month. So keep in mind that the denominator is different for each month depending on the number of players in that top cut and the lists that were available, so I would say don't focus too much on the exact percentages but more so the trend. So to help you understand this graph, in July 2021 at LCS 15, Ash was in 3/4 of the topping deck list, and it was also tied for the most played among all of the hand traps, the other being Droll. It was the most played hand trap yet again in the next month at the remote dual YCS, but it actually fell all the way to 5th most played in November 2021 at Pack LCS, with less than half of the topping list playing this card. Again, this is when Tri-Lyrilisk was tier 1, and Ash wasn't really doing too much against that deck because it just had so much gas. Now as time progressed, Ash was starting to see more play again, where by April 2022 in YCS Charlotte, it was again the most played hand trap among the topping lists and was in 3/4 of these topping lists. And now in June with the South American and Central American TCG Championships, it was in 92% of the topping list, so essentially was a given that you play this card. While Ash has certainly been mentioned as a quote-unquote low-impact hand trap, it's certainly really generic and covers so many cards that we're now seeing it as a must-play card, especially with the explosion of decks that play branded Fusion. With Power of the Elements coming soon and shaking up the meta drastically, let's see if Ash can still hold the title as the most popular hand trap. Next, we move on to Imperm, which again was a pretty popular card for most of the past year. If we were to actually look beyond the past year, Imperm actually lost play completely at one point when decks like Virtual World with VFD and Eldritch were tier 1 at the same time, since Imperm was not very useful against those strategies. Now in December 2021, which was when the North American Remote Dual YCS took place, Imperm was actually the most popular hand trap among the topping lists, being seen in 83% of these lists. This was when Sword Soul was the clear tier 1 best deck, and Dogmatic Invoke DPE was also a very strong choice, not to mention the Lyrilisk Tri-Brigade was still in it. Interestingly enough, Imperm fell hard for March 2022, which was yet another remote dual YCS. Now for this event, Prank Kids had the highest topping representation, and keep in mind, this is when Brave Token was now newly released. Eldritch had also gone a resurgence during this period as well, so maybe these two decks alone may explain the drastic drop off in popularity of Imperm. But that was short-lived as it slowly climbed back up in popularity and sitting around the 4th most played hand trap among the topping lists in recent events. Next up we have Nibiru, which for the most part has been in a lot of players' side decks at least since its release in the 2019 Megatins. Now in July 2021, when Drytrons and Tri-Brigade were tier 1, Nibiru had really fallen off in popularity. I guess it's because against Tri-Brigade you weren't really Nibiruing them, and while it could still work against Drytron or even Prank Kids, I suppose they did play through Nibiru pretty well. But again, that was very short-lived and Nibiru quickly rose to popularity again since it's a high impact card against most combo strategies, particularly when paired with another hand trap. Nibiru is also interesting because when the format isn't combo heavy, then Nibiru technically isn't good anymore, but then players start to not respect Nib and play greedy, which then Nibiru does become good, so it can catch people off guard. For the most part, it stayed as the second to third most played hand trap in these premier events, although it did have a dip in play on May 2022, which was YCS Bogota and Guadalajara, which was the first premier event that showcased Branded Despia following the Alba structure decks, so I guess players didn't play Nib as much as Branded Despia was not really prone to Nibiru, at least at that point. Now let's cover Droll, which is basically the definition of a format dependent hand trap. So you see that from July 2021 it was very popular, not surprising considering that the best deck in Drytron was very search heavy. Even by November 2021 it was still very popular and in fact was the most played hand trap since the best deck at that point was Tri-Brigade Lyrilisk, which was also very search heavy. It would then fall off for March 2022 with the remote YCS, I guess because the best deck was Prank Kids Brave and Droll has typically not been too impactful against Prank Kids. Was still a bit surprising that it fell off this hard since Dragon Link, Brave, and Drytron were still really strong decks at this time as well, not to mention Flunder. While it's lost a lot of popularity in a lot of the recent in-person events, it's actually risen again a lot in popularity as of the South and Central American TCG Championships because of the rise in Punk variants taking up most of the pie chart. With a deck like Sprite coming into the meta soon, I'm sure Droll will remain popular yet again. Then we have Valor, yet another monster negation hand trap and a very old one at that, and honestly for the past year it's been shown to be relatively stable in terms of its popularity. Valor has its pros and cons compared to Imperm, but in instances where Prank Kids is in the top cut, then you are probably likely to see a lot of Valor since they were able to draw off pranks at end phase, and drawing into a Valor would be live for the opponent's turn compared to Imperm, which would be dead. Even in the current format it's popular because aside from serving as a hand trap, worst case it is a light monster, which can be an important attribute when it comes to dumping for branded fusion if you're a deck that does a lot of light attributes, not to mention it is a tuner so it can start the health plays. Then we have Gamma, which at one point when Virtual World VFT was tier 1 back at the end of 2020, it was super popular, but now the card has been sort of meh in terms of popularity, although it is still played by a decent number of decks but has again fallen in play in the recent events. I suppose players are more so leaning towards just playing Imperms and Valors, which while they may not be able to destroy the monster, at least you don't have to play the brick and driver, and you can also resolve the multiple copies that you draw. Next we have Artifact Lancea, which similar to Droll is also very format dependent and perhaps even more so, was decently played from July 2021 to December of that year because while it could slow down certain decks like Tri-Brigade, really was completely useless against the top deck in Drytron. But then in March 2022 with the remote dual YCS, Lancea actually was the most played hand trap among the topping list, being seen in 89% of the list. Some of the top decks that could be impacted by Lancea were Sword Soul, Fluwandereeze, and Virtual World, but at the same time, I think it wasn't as high impact as people thought, as Lancea's popularity did immediately crash right after, especially with Prank Kids Brave being the top deck for YCS Charlotte, and that deck hardly banishes. Since then, it has not been popular as even the top decks that banish seem to be able to play through Lancea anyways. Another old hand trap that's sneakily been seeing a good amount of play throughout the past year is DD Crow, although for example in an event like December 2021, this is largely influenced by the fact that the top decks in Tri-Brigade Lyrilisk played usually just one of this as it was searchable, so it wasn't necessarily because it was really good against most decks, but rather because it was easily accessible for a top deck. While it did start declining in popularity, it recently has come back in play in in-person events, with over half of the topping list playing this card at the South and Central American TCG Championships. It can hit Branded Despia pretty hard, not to mention Illich is very popular again nowadays, and DD Crow is just so deadly against that deck. It's always been good against decks like Sky Striker and Salamangreat, which have also proven to be tier 2 decks in the recent format. Next is one of the Ghost Girls, which last summer was quite popular since it was great against Tri-Brigade Revolt, albeit only if they did not happen to have Appaloosa, and was also strong against many of the Drytron cards. In November, the popularity of Belle fell off really hard, but interestingly enough for May 2022, when we had YCS Bogota and Guadalajara, it was actually tied for first as the most played hand trap. This was likely since this was the first premier event featuring Branded Despia, and players thought that Belle would be a good counter to the strategy, although later we sort of found out that Belle isn't that great since Branded Loss will protect against it, and you do see that by the TCG Championships, the play of Belle fell hard. And lastly, we have Ghost Ogre, which really was not seeing any play at all in the earlier events in 2021 and sort of exploded onto popularity because of the introduction of the Brave token engine, not to mention it was also worth running to pop the map for Flunder. Became essentially a necessary staple in people's main or side deck, only for it to come crashing down in popularity given that it is not a good card against Branded Despia and alright against Sword Soul. It may still see some plays given that E-Tally is at 3, but looks like for now, it is not played in most lists. Alright guys, so that was it for the hand trap trend analysis. Hope you enjoyed that. If this video does well, then I can do another similar video but looking at other side deck staples like board breakers and the like. As always, a big thanks to my Patreons, Eileen Dice Queen, Bolt Spider, Cybernetic, Brandon Jaren, Barrelord, Spooky Boogie, Gridora, and Stephen Phillips as always for supporting the channel. You guys are amazing. If you're interested in joining my Patreon, link down below. Take care guys.